This is an It's Your Break production, so sit back and take a break. Welcome to It's Your Break. Hi, I'm Jonathan Mertz, and coming up on today's show, we're going to be talking to the mind behind a powerful documentary called Growing Up Milwaukee, which is available on HBO Max. Well, what is it all about? And why is it so powerful? You'll find out next here on It's Your Break. It's Your Break will return right after this. Subscribe to the It's Your Break podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Audible, YouTube, and iHeartRadio. And now, back to It's Your Break. Welcome back to It's Your Break. Hi, I'm Jonathan Mertz, and like I said earlier, today's episode is going to be focused around a documentary that you can watch right now on HBO Max. It's called Growing Up Milwaukee, and we have the mind and the creator behind it, Tyshun Wardlaw. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
You know, before we get talking about your documentary, which is very powerful, by the way, I would like to get to know you, if it's okay. Awesome. So a little bit about me. I am an entrepreneur, which I started on my entrepreneurship journey 6 years ago with creating Wardlaw Productions, which currently has an office that just opened up in Wicker Park in Chicago. And we have an office as well as in Milwaukee, where we do feature docs, which once again, we'll talk about today, our first feature doc that was released through the company, as well as featured narratives, short films, and also branded content. So you grew up in Wisconsin as well. That's very interesting. So what part of Wisconsin are you from?
So I was born and raised in Milwaukee. So born and raised in Milwaukee. However, I call myself a self-proclaimed floater because right after high school, I moved out to the West Coast to attend undergrad at Santa Clara University. And then after that, I moved back to the Midwest in anticipation and working in Chicago, actually for the Oprah Winfrey Show, but that kind of got pushed back. So I made a detour in news production at the CBS affiliate. And then I was an associate producer for the ABC affiliate here in Milwaukee, transferred out of news, got into the talk show world, moved back over to California to work on the Jeff Probst Show. That got canceled. So then I moved back. So this is all the floating. I moved back to Chicago to work on the Steve Harvey Show and then also do some freelancing as a producer for other television production companies in Chicago. And then that's when I decided, you know what, I'm not going to wait. This is about 2015. And I said that I'm no longer going to wait on contracts, that I'm going to be my own. So then that's when Wardlaw Productions was born.
Oh, that's very, very interesting. So has like film and videography in the cinematic, even in the cinematic world, has it always been your passion? Did you want to be that as a kid, or was your dream something different as a kid?
Interestingly, and now when I think about it as an adult, like how I thought that I wanted to go to the business school because I wanted to be a manager. So I assumed that, you had to go to school for business and, kind of work your way up in the business world as a manager. But my love for for film and wanting to get into the entertainment industry actually happened, I can say now by purpose, but I thought at the moment by default, when I was coming home one summer from California and we were filming actually in Milwaukee, Mr. 3000, which is dating me like many, many years ago with Bernie Mac.
Right.
They were using the newly built Brewer Stadium. And I had the opportunity for a few months when they were in Milwaukee to actually work as an extra casting assistant. And from that moment, I absolutely loved it. It was intense. It was like 12 hours. And then if we were actually at the stadium, it was about 16 hours worth of filming. So from that experience, going into my sophomore year, I decided that I actually wanted to focus in on television and film and do something in that world. So I stayed in the business school. However, I focused all of my work experience then, out moving forward in something in television. So like I had an internship at NBC 11 at a news station in San Jose before I moved back to the West Coast. I mean, not West Coast, but to the Midwest to actually, interview for a paid position at the Oprah Winfrey Show for an internship. So that was kind of like my course on how I got into it.
Oh, that's very, very interesting.
That
is cool.
It was kind of by chance. And then from there, kind of focusing in on wanting to actually work in the talk show world, but then making a default into news. So really my background kind of focused in the beginning. Before I became a filmmaker, I was actually more in like the production, the producing realm of things, and kind of working my way up in the producer realm. But then that's, like I said, I decided that I was no longer going to wait on any more contracts and I was going to be my own. And so then that's when I went full force to want to be able to create my own content. And so that's when I actually got behind the camera and less logistics. Even still, I produce for my own stuff, but focusing on directing as well.
I kind of had a similar experience. I started radio when I was 16. I'm 41 now. And so, we had a shadow business class. So I got to shadow one of the radio stations, and that's kind of how I got my start. So getting that experience and getting around that environment, I totally understand what you're talking about, because when you're in that environment, you're like, oh yeah, this is it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, really, really fascinating. Why did you decide to start making documentaries?
Well, I wanted to first and foremost, once again, create my own content, but it just happened that I wanted to focus on, when I became a little bit more stationary and stayed more in the Midwest, I wanted to focus on the issues that were happening right in my hometown. And I noticed, unfortunately, that Milwaukee has very staggering statistics when it's concerning the Black community. Unfortunately, it's ranked in the last few years the worst place for Blacks to live and actually grow up. Statistically, in Milwaukee, they have high incarceration rates of Black and brown men, and which are staggering as well. As far as like the education disparities, like all of these things. So I wanted to focus on it from a doc perspective because I wanted to tell the stories behind the statistics. And I didn't want to do that in a narrative format because I wanted to follow the lives of Black inner city youth and actually see what it means for them to grow up in the city day in and day out. But actually, I also did a narrative piece while I was preparing for the documentary and raising funding and getting my name out there as a company, which was a narrative piece. Also, focusing in on issues that were happening in Milwaukee with human trafficking. They're also known, unfortunately, as a top human trafficking hub. But I looked at that story from a narrative perspective because I wanted to be able to add a little bit more of a dramatic feel to it and write the story. But that did require like intense research because I just didn't want to just assume that I knew, what could potentially happen in a human traffic situation. So I had to do in-depth research, but wanting to actually do a documentary stem from wanting to tell the stories behind the statistics in my city.
I've got more follow-up questions just to your study and how these things develop, but let's just start talking about, because it seems like everything that we're going to go for is going to revolve around a lot around your documentary. So for those that don't know, we mentioned it a few minutes ago. It's Growing Up Growing Up Milwaukee, and it is a very powerful documentary, and so much so that I'm going to be honest with you, I was in tears in certain points of it, and because Markel, and he got my attention right off the bat, and he's one of the three teens that you kind of have focused on in that documentary, and seeing some of his hardship is just eye opening, because you don't know unless you live those lives. When you were developing this documentary, or any documentary, what are your processes to put in and to really develop these types of stories?
Well, actually, the Growing Up Milwaukee documentary was my first feature as well as documentary. But the approach that I took with that was, once again, I wanted to tell the stories of Black inner city youth, but I also wanted to do it from an observational standpoint. So I decided early on, even before we selected the future youth and everything, that I didn't want to just give a timeline of why is all these statistics happen? How did we get there? So I didn't want it to be information based. I wanted to be story and emotion driven. So I had to decide that very early on because that was going to be the base of my story as well as my outline. So with taking that approach, as soon as we got funding, immediately I approached youth-based organizations to see if, and I hate to say casting call, because once again, this is a documentary, but to actually put fillers out to say, do you know know of any youth that are dealing with issues or, may have some things that are surrounding some of the statistics that are coming out of Milwaukee, because I would love to film with them and possibly, even have a transformation on camera, because I wanted to be very transparent and honest with the youth. Even before we started filming that, I want you to be able to tell your unedited truth, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so I want to be just kind of like a fly on the wall. I want to observe you. I don't want to, Hollywood the story. And I know with a documentary, it is like less produced, than a narrative, where you don't know exactly how the story is going to unfold until you're actually done, with the footage and or however you structured your documentary as far as presenting the information. So I did use that off top, that I wanted to observe them and allow the story to unfold that way. So that's how I did it. And then from there, I inserted experts to talk about some of the issues that the youth were facing and that we see unfold on camera.
Yeah, one of the statistics that I thought was just astronomical, and I can't believe it, but it's 32%. 32% of African American men do not graduate. Period. In Milwaukee, that's staggering. So is it just they why are they so proportionately not being able to graduate? Because I don't know if I grasped that real well.
And I think, unfortunately, it's some of the conditions that have been presented, whether that's home and a lot of things that I even learned when I was filming. I believe it's called trauma-informed care, and I hope I said that correctly. But the youth are facing so much that may have an effect even on their education, that they have special classes and different things that I would have never even imagined when I was in high school. And whoa, I'm like super dating myself for that, because that was like 20 years ago. Our 20th anniversary is next year. And so just to realize that the youth are facing so much, and unfortunately those home circumstances affect, these trauma that they're dealing with affects how they receive education. It affects how they learn. So some of them, either, they're working, as we saw with some of those youth, like a youth even said, like, I'm literally fending for myself. Like I work hours, day in and day out. I come to school when I can because I'm more concerned about, taking care of myself. Like my mom, my dad isn't there. So it's just so many internal factors that are contributing, unfortunately, to those staggering statistics.
Yeah, I mean, it's just I just couldn't imagine it. Hearing those numbers, I'm like, whoa, you're telling me way less than even 50% or even, graduating. And even at 50%, it's way, way too low. Even 80%, in my opinion, is too low. I don't know. I'm gonna get tongue tied because it's such a shock to me. You know what I'm saying? But even the facts that you had mentioned this earlier too, and it's in your documentary that Wisconsin, the state, has the highest incarceration rate of brown and black people, and to me that it's per capita and statistically, and that that is just to me that's shocking too, because you see them consider them more of a northern state, across that Mason-Dixon line. Of course, I'm in Kentucky, so I know some of the divides. In my rural county that I grew up in Henry County, there was one town that had 90% to 95% of all African Americans and Hispanics, and outside of in the rest of the county, you didn't see any other people of color. So. Growing up, I seen some of this, and I got, I was fortunate enough that I was in the town that had this, this mixing, but other people in that county didn't even see anybody till they came to Eminence, for the first time, maybe at 5 or 6, or, because not everybody goes to that town of Eminence, but, so it is still a divide out there, and people don't realize how divided sometimes we are and how segregated we are, even though there is technically by law, no more segregation. What do you think is the main cause of this? Is it just geographical? Is it old tradition? Is it, what do you think from seeing all the research you've done and everything? What is causing these kind of divides?
And I believe it's a combination of a little bit of everything. And I think also Ava DuVernay's 13 kind of really hit it home on how profitable, the prison system is. And that's just across the U.S. And I would, be remiss if I said like Wisconsin didn't benefit from that, because these are private prisons and institutions, that are housing. And some of these offenses are very, and I'm not saying that one offense is greater than the other, but some things are very minor. But it's unfortunate that, the staggering statistics will say that, out of so many groups of men, like probably 50% of these men will be in prison at some point for something. And you really have to look at that and say, is that beneficial? And I know here in Wisconsin as well, even from a few people that I've worked with in the film, that they're working on, alternatives to that prison, pipeline system to say, how can we do more reform versus, locking them up. And just sending them away, and then the prison system is very profitable. So I believe that it's a lot of factors. Unfortunately, that's going to take quite some time from all type of levels, whether that's the city level, the state level, the federal level, to really key in and change that problem, because it is a very profitable business, and unfortunately, sometimes it's over a lot of people pay grades. So. It's still happening.
It's staggering to watch the news sometimes too, because like I'm right outside of Louisville, Kentucky, so we get all the news, our news sources from Louisville, and you can watch the west end of Louisville, which is typically our higher African American, brown population, and black population are right in that area. And it's just like news story after news story. That's the only thing you hear about violence. You don't hear from any other ends of the towns or the community. And your documentary also focuses on how the media just focuses on certain narratives and doesn't tell other stories. And I totally understand that, because I'm like, I want more positive news. I get it. You want to tell what's happened as a tragedy, but let's focus on some of the good so we can spread some good. Good influence is good, in my opinion. It makes people want to do more. What do you think is the major problem with news and how they cover any given story, or even African American and brown people all across the globe?
The thing that I think, and also, being close to a large market like Chicago, and I think that's number 3, or if it hasn't changed in the news market, sometimes it's just straight hard news, news coverage. There's, they'll throw in a light and fluffy story every now and then that you may see a local package, but it's all about the bottom line. It's about reporting, getting the first, and I worked in the news industry, getting the first information, being the first one to break the story. And sometimes those breaking stories may not be, as beneficial as a lighter and fluffy community story would be, but it's about the bottom line, even in the news industry, unfortunately. And that's across markets, whether it's a major market, a smaller market. And so most news stations tend to go towards that harder news, breaking news, updates. And then they'll probably pad the rundown with a few fluffy things for the kicker at the end of the show or the middle of the show. But I think sometimes it's all about the bottom line and who can get the story first or the exclusive first. And I think, even as communities across the U.S., that we need to start focusing in on, how do we change the narrative besides how we've reported it even over the last few years? Over the, last decades, like, why don't we get different perspectives? Even because, I think it's the news cliche where it's like, okay, they're going to wait to talk to the worst person to be able to get, the footage from or the inside scoop on. Like, you couldn't bring in an expert to talk about that, but sometimes network news, they're known for that. They're not going to pull citizens off the street. But I think if we take the time to really show and be concerned about how we're telling these stories versus being concerned about who's breaking the news first or who's getting the most news coverage, that I think it will be a change. And then also, if we have people of color that's making decisions as well about how the news are being reported. I know that this one thing, like when I was in the news industry over 12 years ago, there was not that many women and or men of color in those boardrooms, news directors and things of that nature. So I also think that that's beneficial to have people in place that could say, we're going to learn how to be able to tell this story in a different way that's beneficial for everyone who's viewing it and everyone who the story is about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you don't have representation, you can't really relate. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You may know some facts or things from anything you may have read. You may have had friends, or you may even had some interaction into degree. But until you walk into somebody's shoes, you're not really going to know what they've been through or how they've been through. I don't care who
Absolutely.
you are. I don't care who you are. And
So
and
representation is important.
Absolutely,
Mhm.
absolutely it is. And there's things that we just don't think about sometimes, that can be insensitive, and we really don't know that it's insensitive, or or just out of
Mhm.
character. And I think a lot about these things myself. And one of the things I think about is, how do we, as a community, just get together and come to a resolve? One of the questions is, like, I
Mhm.
always have, is like, okay, yeah, so and so shut some of so, but why did they really get to that?
Mhm.
Is it drug related? Is it a spousal feud? Is it
Mhm.
a jealous ex lover? But why were we there in the first place? What led
Mhm.
us to these positions? Why are we so enraged with each other? I don't care who you are, what color, skin color.
Mhm.
Why do we get to these points that lead us down these paths that make us have these irrational actions?
I
What do
agree.
we
I
do?
agree. And I
You
think
know,
it's the way we tell our stories. Once again, representation. Maybe looking at a different format that's not the traditional format of journalism. Not to say that it hasn't worked, because it was set in place for a reason, and this is how we've done it for years. But there's also change for a reason as well, and adapting to new situations. Like I said, that will be beneficial for the viewer and the person that the story is about. So I think it would be beneficial just across the U.S. to maybe even evaluate the process on how we report journalism and how we report the stories, and how can we be less biased in our stories, whether that's towards race or gender or anything of that nature. So I think it's just really a restructuring of the system together, and being bold enough to even stand up to do it. Not to say that you got to fight the system all by yourself, but I think if we come together collectively, and decide that hey, there's better ways that we could get the story and the positioning out there, then maybe change will start happening.
it's like, yeah, how do you reinvent the wheel sometimes when it comes
Hmm.
to redoing and rethinking the way we focus the media? And propaganda sometimes it
Hmm.
plays in a part of that. Did you see any type of that stuff happening firsthand when you were in the newsroom?
Of course, yeah. And then once again, I worked for a CBS and ABC affiliate, and I would say probably a little bit, more on the CBS side, because sometimes ABC is really strict with their hard news. But I mean, it's everywhere, and it's not escaping that, because once again, a lot of formats are given, and a lot of procedures in the newsroom are followed from ways that has been set forth many, many years ago, which, once again, not saying it's outdated, but once again, like you said, we need to reinvent the wheel on how we're telling the story. So it's always present. And even network news as well. You'll see it, but they just, present it in a better package sometimes. But it's always there.
Yeah, and I feel like we could probably go on this topic over and over and again for hours at a time, to be honest. But I want to get back to your documentary
Mhm.
stuff. When you were doing the research for Growing Up Milwaukee, how did you just decide these are the specific things I want to focus on to break down how your documentary flow? I mean, how did you kind of storyboard it a little bit, or from your stats, or how did that go? I know you had to base some of it on the actual footage you gather, but
Yep.
how
So
does
for
flow?
for me, because I took the observational approach, I used what I gathered, kind of build the story in the editing process, which also worked out for me, because sometimes you may get absolutely nothing, and you're like, oh my gosh, we filmed, and it's like, how do I put this together? So basically, I did go on a whim to say, like, my story is going to be based on, I did have an idea, like, I do want certain experts to kind of talk about X, Y, and Z. And as we were filming, when I noticed, I would put a pin, because we filmed for 2 years. So we were basically in pre-production for 2 years. And then the real magic happened, when we got our first round of funding and we actually started filming. So once we started filming, I would take like storyboard notes to say, we did address this, or this happened there, because once again, I didn't know exactly how long we would be filming, and I knew in a perfect world, we do have a indie budget, but then again, I didn't want to, cap, even if we did have to, I would try to make a way out of no way, even if we did have to film a little bit longer to continue to bring their story around fully. So I did take like mental storyboard notes when crucial things would happen that we would film with them. Once again, that I wanted them to be able to share their unedited truth. And I didn't want to force them to be able to say, well, maybe you should do this, or maybe you should do that, or maybe we want to know that. I just allowed their process to flow, and also introduced them to organizations that would be able to aid them in whatever they were doing. A prime example, like with Tiana, before we met her, she was already working on music. She was already, writing and producing, but she never knew that there was a hidden gem right in her city, that's available for teenagers for free, for the cost of teenagers to be able to go to utilize, to cultivate your gift. And so we introduced, that was more on the strategic end, like Tiana, like we need you to meet them, because, they can help you and aid you along the process, that you're not, out here on your own, that they can help you cultivate your gift. So things like that, where I made sure, wherever they were in their life, I tried to meet them there, whether that was introducing them to someone. And that kind of helped me with the storyboarding. And then when we were actually done filming, I did the reverse with the experts, and I made sure that I crafted all of their interview questions that would hit points on what I was able to pick up from the youth and what we were able to film over the course of the 2 years, so that they could talk exactly to that. I didn't want to go in and say, well, let me maybe give them, a ballpark of questions and see what I can draft out of it. No, I was very strategic. Like, this is the area that I want to touch upon. Why is this, at that moment? So that's kind of how I crafted the story.
That's interesting. I always love to hear how these things come together. Because, putting the thought into it and just dealing with what you've got and making a story just out of random footage. In some cases, some cases it's designed, but in other cases you're actually following even in the design area, you're wanting to try to find the real authenticity of what's happening. And with, Marquel, Brandon, and Tiana, you see that in each one of their storylines. And it's just so fascinating to see them and how much inspiration they still try to have in themselves, even though they've been thrown bad cards left and right. Sometimes things that they do is self-inflicted. It's amazing when you watch the people that talk to them, like when Brandon got expelled and he had to explain why he got expelled. You see people actually take, a concerned approach towards him and say, hey, these are things that we maybe think about not doing. I know the things may not have been intentional, but then it sets you back. But it's fascinating to me to see people taking so much involvement. I wish we had more involvement in youth. What are your thoughts when we should be approaching in youth, and especially because every teenager is going to act up, but how should we really be approaching our youth?
I think it's just kind of, meeting them on their level. That's what I learned. Because once again, even when I was growing up as a teenager many years ago, teens for myself, and I don't say that I speak for everyone in my generation that was teens about, 20 something years ago, but our biggest issue or struggle was, as a teen girl, like not getting pregnant, not hanging around the wrong crowd, not smoking weed, not all pills and X, Y, and Z and this, that, and the other, and back, with the say no to drugs. That's when we were like younger and, they had that whole movement. So we knew that, but that was our biggest struggles. But now I feel like because they're facing so many other variants that we have to say, you know what, let me meet you on your level. Don't let me assume that I know. Don't let me use my own experience to understand you. Let me see exactly where you are, because I want you to know that I see you. I understand you. And I want to know what it is that I can do, to assist you. And sometimes that may be absolutely nothing, but being a listening ear, or that might be, a voice or a resource. But I think as adults, we can be as resourceful as possible to see what level can we meet these youth on. And I think that's just across the board in any city, whether it's, a small city, a rural city, a major city, we can always be resourceful and see what can we do, even in our own communities, to be able to help and aid the youth.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a struggle to even get communities behind that sometimes, especially on the political spectrum, because they want the funding to go other places that's more lucrative for the city, and not put an investment in something that they think is not profitable. And I think that's a focus that we really need to put on, because they're missing potential profit. I'm not kidding. I believe that whole those communities that are rural, that are struggling sometimes, or even in inner cities that are the same way, where there's no funding. The stores are shutting down. You've got to go further away from your neighborhood to even get to a grocery store. If we put the investment back in it, I think we're going to get a return out of it. And nobody's wanting to do that.
Yeah. And it's just so unfortunate. It's so unfortunate. And sometimes, and I know we could probably go on for that days as well, it's political.
Oh, yeah.
And it's an agenda behind it. And I think that's what made me also want to focus in on some of these grassroots organizations that I was filming with, because they're like, we don't need for you to be able to pump your dollars in this. We're going to take our own dollars, and we're going to tell our boys that we care about you. I'm going to fund my own book. I'm going to publish my own book, and I'm going to get out there, and link up and see if I can get in these schools, and, whether it's a huge contract or not, to say, what, I have something that these kids need, and I'm willing to give it to them, and I'm willing to put myself out there, even if it's digging in my own pocket. So that's some things that, I felt was very pivotal, with even being able to show that people are on the ground running day in and day out. It doesn't mean that it's, a multi, or $100,000 contract or anything like that. Like, it literally could be, I'm pumping my own money into this, but I believe in it so much. I'm so passionate about it that I'm not going to wait for me to get permission to be able to be great with these young men. So I really respected that with a lot of organizations that I ran across and filmed with in the actual documentary.
What's disheartening is sometimes that people who do come from these environments that do thrive, they've left, they've gone out, made major careers for themselves, or even been very successful entrepreneurs, sometimes don't go back and reinvest. Well, for sometimes it's based off trauma, obviously, they don't want to go back to something that is haunted them. But at the same time, you got to think, in order to make something better, we've got to reinvest in it, even if it has caused us some disheartening. How do we get people who are successful, that have come up in these environments, that know the ins and outs, to go back and maybe start to reinvest?
And I can actually use myself. I know that I'm just getting started. And I love to say that, I'll probably end up on the moon, but Milwaukee is always home. I'm not necessarily from Chicago, but I consider it home as well. I have family there. My father is from there. But I feel like, going back to your community is one of the best things you can do, whether that's just, not as a resident there, or just you're setting your presence there, because it's telling people that I didn't forget where I came from. And like you said, sometimes it is associated with trauma, and you may not want to return there because it may, bring up some memories and things that may not be too fond of you. But I feel like it's so much more powerful for you to show that, I want to give back to my community because someone poured into me. Most of the times, those successful people that kind of leave the community or go, whether that was your parents, whether that was your village of friends or family or people in the community, someone took the time to say, Jonathan, I care about you and I see the potential in you. So I think that just allows the community to say, she does care, or he does care on some magnitude, and they're giving back to show that, all hope isn't lost in this city, in this area, in this focus. So I think it is important. on all levels to be able to go back at some point, and to be able to contribute, whether that's financially, just being a resource, doing campaigns, or just being a voice. It matters, and people hear that, and people see it, and they understand when you do get back.
That is really, really good advice. And some of the things that you were saying there, I was like, oh, wow, that's really inspiring. To think about and to put yourself out there. And one of the things that I think about too is sometimes they don't have to do it in person. Mm-hmm. They can do it as, a gift through another company or something that way to give back. And then sometimes they can even give back silently. That's another thing. If you really don't want your name associated with something like that. And there's so many different avenues and so many different inspiring organizations now that I find really, really fascinating. When you approached the groups that you were working with, what was one of them that you found just standing out above the rest?
I would say, and this is once again because the example that I use as far as like really dipping into their own funding was probably the Flood the Hood with Dreams. And interestingly, two men that were in the documentary found it together, but we didn't see them together on the camera. So that was Muhib Dyer, who we saw in the spoken word. We also saw him kind of narrate. He was kind of like almost our narrator. We saw him the most as he kind of flowed through the documentary. And then also Kwamanan Nixon. So they are two co-founders of Flood Your Hood with Dreams. And I believe that probably out of all of the other organizations, they're the ones that are probably like the most grassroots, where they actually put their own money and their own funding. Like a prime example, I know one of them actually gives out a $500 scholarship that he gives out his own pocket to young men who are going to college, who writes an essay, and then they're able to in turn, bless that young man with the $500 scholarship. So I was most I would say, inspired by them, because once again, they may not have that structure and all of the grant money that are coming in like a lot of the other youth-based organizations that probably have had a little bit more solid foundation with establishing themselves as a nonprofit and all of those things. But yet that didn't stop them. They're still going out. Like I said, they're still, pumping into these youth, even with their own money. So I highly respect that, because it says that, we're not waiting, because I'm the queen of like, I'm not going to wait on permission. I'm going to go do it myself. Or, how they say like, build the table. Like that's what they're doing. Like, don't wait for a seat at the table, build the table. So I highly respect those two kings just for being able to get out there no matter what.
And Mr. Dyer on the documentary was just so fascinating, and to hear his spoken word poetry was just powerful. It was really powerful, and that was a guy that I keyed on as well in that documentary. So that is really, really fascinating that those two came together on that. I didn't realize that. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we don't see them on camera, because when I approach both of them, when we see the opening scene, Muhib was supposed to be there, but I think he had a conflict with scheduling that day, so he couldn't come to that actual session that they were doing in not middle school, but in the high school. So I was just so excited to catch him on the back end of filming, and I said I knew that. I told him, I said, look, I know I need to have you in this documentary. I know that we didn't get a chance to see you on camera interacting with the youth, but you have to be in this doc. And he was open and like, sister, I got whatever you need. I'm here for you. So I was excited for the reception of just even the people allowing me, even in their lives, because being an indie filmmaker, I didn't come, even though I'm on HBO Max with the end of distribution, I wasn't, it's not an HBO original. So I didn't come say, hey, we're going to be on HBO. Then everybody be like, oh, okay, cool, I'll be in it. I'm like, hey, I'm an indie film. I'm putting this documentary together. We have a non-existent budget, and, I'm here and I want to tell these stories. And they, opened their arms to me, and I was excited about that. So very appreciative and blessed for the reception of being able to film with me.
Yeah, and if you haven't had a chance, go out and watch the video. It's amazing. And if you got HBO Max like I did, it was a no-brainer just to flip it on and just watch it and let it roll through. And it's so powerful. It really is. And I keep saying that over and over. So it's got me interested in seeing, what do you have in store for us next?
The sky is the limit. So I am, once again, like I said, I'm based both in Chicago and Milwaukee. So I just plan on continuing to build the company. I'm in my 6th year as a production company that can produce, whether it's our own content and or for studio quality films, to be able to produce, whether that's documentaries, whether that's narratives, and just keep getting the ball rolling and building and being able to be an awesome creative hub, even for creatives as they come. And I would like to, not to say like employ, but deploy, because I want them to continue doing, the best. I don't believe that they have to necessarily come work with me and retire. I want them to flourish in whatever, area is their purpose. But when they're with me, I would love to make sure that they're also cultivating their gifts. And we're coming together to tell some awesome and amazing stories. So that's just what I continue to plan on doing, is just continuing to forge forward and making it happen and bringing great stories, believing on a studio and network level.
That is cool that you're wanting to put that investment into other people so that they can flourish too. That's really, really cool. Tyshun, if anybody wanted to find out how to get a hold of you or more information about you, where can they go?
Awesome. So they can go to my website, which is www.wardlaw, WARDLAWTV.com. Also, all of my social media platforms, which is the name of my company, which is Wardlaw Productions, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and then my personal, because I'm trying to tweet a little bit more. My tweet game is a little off, but on Twitter, it's at Tyshun Wardlaw, so TYSHUN, and then Wardlaw, as well as my own personal Instagram, which is TY Wardlaw. So definitely come, send me an email on the website. We would love to connect and even, possibly partner with people who want to tell amazing stories if it goes with the vision and everything aligns. So I'm here and I'm ready to connect.
If there was any advice you could give to anybody that's wanting to tell their own story out there, what would you give them?
So from the filmmaker's perspective, I would say go for it. And I think I'm probably the most radical person and optimistic person like people would want to meet, because I'm always talking about positioning. And you never know if you don't get started. You may not know all the answers. You may not know how it's going to turn out. Prime example, when I set out to create the Growing Up Milwaukee documentary, my objective was I'm taking this film national. I didn't even film it yet, but I knew that was my objective. So I would say find an objective, find a goal, find a purpose, and you go after it. Even if you get knocked down, get back up. Even if you don't have funding, go find it, crawl under a rock, and or maybe even start without it. But make sure you get it done, because if you never do it, the ideal is just going to die right where it is, an ideal. So I would say execute it and go after it.
Tyshun, thank you so much for coming on our show, and hopefully we can get back together and do some more interviews for some of your future projects.
I would love to, and thank you for having me. It has been a pleasure.